welcome to me reading you my first episode on the second book, Alex Rider, Point Blanc, or in France as they call it, Point Blanc. I'm just going to call it Point Blanc. Chapter 1, Going Down. Michael J. Roscoe was a careful man. The car that drove him to work at 7:15 each morning was a custom-made Mercedes with reinforced steel doors and bulletproof windows. His driver, a retired FBI agent, carried a Beretta subcompact semi-automatic pistol and knew how to use it. There were just 5 steps from the point where the car stopped to the entrance of Roscoe Tower on New York's 5th Avenue, but CCTV cameras followed him every inch of the way. Once the automatic doors had slid shut behind him, a uniformed receptionist, also armed, watched as he crossed the foyer and entered his own private lift. The lift had white marble walls, a blue carpet, a silver handrail, and no buttons. Roscoe pressed his hand against a small glass panel. A sensor read his fingerprints, verified them, and activated the lift. The door slid shut and the lift rose to the 16th floor. Without stopping, nobody else ever used it, nor did it ever stop at any of the other floors in the building. While he was travelling up, the receptionist was on the telephone letting Mr. Roscoe's staff know that he was on his way. Everyone who worked in Roscoe's private office had been handpicked and thoroughly vetted. It was impossible to see him without an appointment. Getting an appointment to take 3 months. When you're rich, you have to be careful. There are cranks, kidnappers, terrorists, the desperate, and the depossessed. Mitchell J. Roscoe was the chairman of Roscoe Electronics and the 9th or 10th richest man in the world. And he was very careful indeed. Ever since his face had appeared on the front cover of Time magazine, the Electronic King, he had realized that he had become a visible target. So when in public, he walked quickly with his head bent. The glasses that he wore had been chosen to hide as much as possible of his round, handsome face. His suits were expensive, but anonymous. If he went to the theatre or to dinner, he always arrived at the last minute, preferring not to hang around. There were dozens of different security systems in his life, and although they had once annoyed him, he had allowed them to become routine. But ask any spy or security agent, routine is the one thing that can get you killed. It tells you the enemy where you're going and when you're going to be there. Routine was going to kill Mitchell J. Roscoe, and this was the day death had chosen to come calling. Of course, Roscoe had no idea of this as he stepped out of the lift directly into his private office, a huge room occupying in the corner of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows giving views in two directions. 5th Avenue to the north, Central Park to the west. The 2 remaining walls contained a door, a low bookshelf, and next to the lift, a single old painting, a vase of flowers by Vincent van Gogh. The black glass surface on his deck was equally uncluttered. A computer, a leather notebook, a telephone, and a framed photograph of a 14-year-old boy. As he took off his jacket and sat down, Roscoe found himself looking at the picture of the boy. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and freckles. Poor Roscoe looked remarkable like his father 40 years ago. Roscoe was now 54, beginning to show his age, despite his year-round tan. His son was almost as tall as him. The picture had been taken the summer before on Long Island. They had spent the day sailing. Then they had a barbecue on the beach. It would be one of the few happy days they've ever had together. The door opened and his secretary came in. Helen Bosworth was English. She had left her home and her husband to come and work in New York and loved every minute of it. She had been working in this office for 11 years, and in all that time she had never forgotten a detail or made a mistake. "Good morning, Mr. Roscoe," she said. "Good morning, Helen." She set down a folder on his paper. The latest figures from Singapore, costing on the R to 15th organizer. You have lunch with Senator Andrews at 12:30. I've booked the Ivy. Did you remember to call London? Roscoe asked. Helen Bosworth blinked. She never forgot anything. So why had he asked? I spoke to Alan Blunt's office yesterday afternoon. Yesterday afternoon, she said. She said. Afternoon in New York would have been evening in London. But Mr. Blunt was not available. But I've arranged a person-to-person call for you this afternoon. We can have it patched through to your car. Thank you, Helen. Shall I have a coffee? Shall I have your coffee sent through to you? No. Shall I have your coffee sent through to you? No, thank you, Helen. I won't have any coffee today. Helen Bosworth left the room, seriously alarmed. No coffee? What next? Mr. Roscoe has begun his day with a double espresso for as long as she had known him. Could it be that he was ill? He certainly hadn't been himself recently, not since Paul had got back from that school in the south of France. And this phone call to Alan Blunt in London? Nobody had ever told her who he was, but she had seen his name in a file once. It was something to do with the British military intelligence, MI6. What was Mr. Roscoe doing talking to a spy? Helen Bosworth returned to her office and soothed her nerves. Not with a coffee. She couldn't stand the stuff. But with a refreshing cup of English breakfast tea. Something very strange was going on, and she didn't like it. She didn't like it at all. Meanwhile, 60 floors below, a man had walked into reception wearing grey overalls with an ID badge attached to his chest. The badge identified him as Sam Green, maintenance engineer with Express Elevators, Inc. He was carrying a briefcase in one hand and a large silver toolbox in the other. He set them both down in front of the reception desk. Sam Green was not his real name. His hair, black and a little greasy, was fake, as were his glasses, moustache, and uneven teeth. He looked 50 years old, but actually nearer 30. Nobody knew his real name, but in the business, he was in. A name was the last thing he could afford. He was known as a gentleman, and He was one of the highest paid and most successful contract killers in the world. But he had been given his nickname because he always sent flowers to the families of his victims. The receptionist glanced at him. "I'm here for the elevator," he said. He spoke with a Bronx accent, even though he had spent more than a week there in his life. "What about here?" the receptionist asked. "You people were here last week." "Yeah, sure. We found a defective cable on elevator 12. It had to be replaced, but we didn't have the parts. So they sent me back." The gentleman fished in his pocket and pulled out a couple of crumpled sheet of papers. "You want to call head office? I've got my orders here." If the receptionist had called Express Elevators Inc., he would have discovered that they did indeed employ a Sam Green, although he hadn't shown up for work for 2 days. This was because the real Sam Green was at the bottom of the Hudson River with a knife in his back and a 20-pound block of concrete attached to his feet. But the receptionist didn't make the call. The gentleman had guessed he wouldn't bother. After all, the lifts were always breaking down. There were engineers in and out the whole time. What difference would one more make? The receptionist jerked a thumb. "Go ahead," he said. The gentleman pulled away the letter, picked up his case and his toolbox, and went over to the lifts. There were a dozen public lifts servicing the skyscrapers, plus a 13 for Mitchell J. Roscoe. Lift number 12 was at the end, and he went in. A delivery boy with a parcel tried to follow. "Sorry," the gentleman said. "Closed for maintenance." The door slid shut. He was on his own. He pressed the button for 61st floor. He had been given this job only a week before. He had to work fast, killing the real maintenance engineer, taking his identity, learning the layout of Roscoe Tower, and getting his hands on sophisticated pieces of equipment he had known he would need. His employers wanted the multi-millionaire eliminated as quickly as possible. More importantly, it had to look like an accident. For this, the gentleman had demanded and been paid $200,000 American dollars. The money was to be paid into a bank account in Switzerland. Half now, half on the completion. Lift door open. The 61st floor was used mainly for maintenance. This was where the water tanks were housed. Also the computers that controlled the heat, air conditioning, security cameras, and lifts throughout the building. The gentleman turned off the lift, using the manual override key that had once belonged to Sam Green. Then went over to the computers. He knew exactly where they were. In fact, he could have found them wearing a blindfold. He opened his briefcase. There were 2 sections to the case. The lower part was a laptop computer. The lid fitted out with a number of drills and other tools, each of them strapped into place. It took him 15 minutes to cut his way into the Roscoe Tower mainframe and connect his laptop to the circuitry inside. Hacking his way past the Roscoe security systems took a little longer, but at last it was done. He tapped a command into his keyboard on the floor below. Mitchell J. Roscoe's private lift did something it had never done before. It rose up 1 extra floor to level 61. The door, however, remained closed. The gentleman did not need to get in. Instead, he picked up the briefcase and the silver toolbox and carried them back into the same lift he had taken from reception. He turned the override key and pressed the button for the 59th floor. Once again, he deactivated the lift. Then he reached up and pushed. In the top of the lift was a trapdoor that opened outwards. He pushed the briefcase and the silver box ahead of him, then pulled himself up and climbed onto the roof of the lift. He was now standing inside the main lift shaft of Roscoe Tower. He was surrounded on four sides by girders and pipes blackened with oil and dirt. Thick steel cables hung down, some of them humming as they carried their loads up and down. Looking down, he could see a seemingly endless square tunnel, illuminated only by the chinks of light from the doors, as it opened and shut again as the other lifts arrived at various floors. Somehow the breeze had made its way in from the street, spinning dust that stung his eyes. Next to him was a second set of lift doors, which had he opened them, would have lead him straight into Roscoe's office. Above these, over his head, and a few meters to the right, was the underbelly of Roscoe's private lift. The toolbox was next to him on the lift roof. Carefully he opened it. The sides of the case were lined with thick sponge. Inside, in a specially moulded space, was what looked like a complicated film projector, silver and concave with a thick glass lens. He took it out, then glanced at his watch. 8:35. It would take him an hour to connect the device to the bottom of Roscoe's lift, and a little more to ensure it was working. He had plenty of time. Smiling to himself, the gentleman took out a poor power screwdriver and began to work. At 12 o'clock, Helen Bosworth called through on the telephone. Your car is here, Mr. Roscoe." "Thank you, Helen." Roscoe hadn't done much that morning. He had been aware that only half his mind was on his work. Once again he glanced at the photograph on his desk. Paul. How could things have gone so wrong between a father and a son? And what could have happened in the last few months to make them so much worse? He stood up, put his jacket on, and walked across his office on his way to lunch with Senator Andrews. He often had lunch with politicians. Neither wanted his money and his ideas or him. Anyone as rich as Roscoe was a powerful friend, and politicians need all the friends they can get. He pressed the lift call button, and the door slid open. He took one step forward. The last thing Mitchell J. Roscoe saw in his life was a lift, with white marble walls, a blue carpet, and a silver handrail. His right foot wearing one of the black leather shoes that were handmade for him by a small shop in Rome, travelled down the rest of his body, followed tilting into the lift, and then through it, and then he was falling 60 floors to his death. He was so surprised by what had happened, so totally unable to understand what had happened, that he didn't even cry out. He simply fell into the blackness of the lift shaft, bounced twice off the walls, then crashed into the solid concrete of the basement 200 meters below. The lift remained where it was. It looked solid, but in fact it wasn't there at all. What Roscoe had stepped into was a hologram being projected into the empty space of the lift shaft, where the real lift should have been. The gentleman had programmed the door to open when Roscoe pressed the call button, and had quietly watched him step into oblivion. If the billionaire had just looked up for a moment, he would have seen the silver hologram projector beaming the image a few meters above him, but a man getting into a lift on his way to lunch does not look up. The gentleman had known this, and he was never wrong. At 12:35, the chauffeur called up to say that Mr. Roscoe hadn't arrived at the car. 10 minutes later, Helen Bosworth alerted security, who began to search the foyer of the building. At 1 o'clock, they called the restaurant. The senator was waiting for his lunch guest, but Roscoe hadn't shown up. In fact, his body wasn't discovered until the next day, which time the billionaire's disappearance had become the lead story on American TV news. A bizarre accident That's what it looked like. Nobody could work out what had happened. Because, of course, by the time the gentleman had reprogrammed the mainframe, removed the projector, and left everything as it should have been before quietly leaving the building. 2 days later, a man who looked nothing like a maintenance engineer walked into JFK International Airport. He was about to board a flight for Switzerland. But first of all, he visited a flower shop and ordered a dozen black tulips to send to a certain address. The man paid with cash. He didn't leave a name. Chapter 2. Blue Shadow. The worst time to feel alone is when you're in a crowd. Alex Ryder was walking across the playground, surrounded by hundreds of boys and girls of about his own age. They were all heading into the same direction, all wearing the same blue and grey uniforms, all of them probably thinking much the same thoughts. The last lesson of the day had the same thoughts. The last lesson of the day had just ended. Homework, tea, and television would fill the remaining hours until bed. Another school day, so why did he feel so out of it? As if he were watching the last weeks of the term from the other side of a giant glass screen. Alex jerked his backpack over one shoulder and continued towards the bike shed. The bag was heavy as usual. It contained double homework, French and history. He had missed 2 weeks of school, and he was having to work hard to catch up. His teachers had not been sympathetic. Nobody had said as much, but when he had finally returned with a doctor's letter, a bad dose of flu with complications, they had nodded and smiled, and secretly thought him a little bit pampered and spoiled. On the other hand, they had to make allowances. They all knew that Alex had no parents, that he had been living with an uncle who had died in some sort of car accident. But even so, 2 weeks in bed, even his closest friend had to admit that was a bit much, and he couldn't tell them the truth. He wasn't allowed to tell anyone what had really happened. That was the hell of it. Alex looked around him at the children streaming through the school gates, some dribbling footballs, some on their mobile phones. He looked at the teachers, curling themselves into the second-hand cars, and at first he had thought that the whole school had somehow changed while he was away, but he knew now that what was happened was worse. Everything was the same. It was he who had changed. Alex was 14 years old, an ordinary schoolboy in an ordinary West London comprehensive or not in a London comprehensive, or he had been. Only a few weeks ago, he had discovered that his uncle had been a secret agent working for MI6. The uncle, Iron Rider, had been murdered, and MI6 had forced Alex to take his place. They had given him a crash course in SAS survival techniques and sent him on a lunatic mission on the south coast. He had been chased, shot at, and almost killed. And at the end of it, he had been packed off and sent back to school, as if nothing had happened. But first, they had made him sign the Official Secrets Act. Alex smiled at the memory of it. He didn't need to sign anything. Why would have believed him anyway? Who would have believed him anyway? But it was the secrecy that was getting him now. Whenever anyone asked him what he had been doing in the weeks he'd been away, he'd been forced to tell them that he'd been in bed reading, slouching around the house, whatever. Alex didn't want to boast about what he'd done, but he hated having to deceive his friends. It made him angry. MI6 had just put him in danger. They'd locked his whole life in filing cabinet and thrown away the key. He had reached the bike shed. Somebody muttered a goodbye in his direction, and he nodded. Then reached up to a brush and the single strand of fair hair that had fallen over his eye. Sometimes he wished that the whole business with MI6 had never happened, but at the same time he had to admit part of him wanted it all to happen again. Sometimes he felt that he would no longer belong in the safe, comfortable world of Blanc school. Too much has changed, and at the end of the day, anything was better than double homework. He lifted his bike out of the shed and unlocked it. Then he clipped on his helmet, pulled the backpack over his shoulder, and prepared to ride away. That was when he saw the beat-up white car back again outside the school gates for a second time that week. Everyone knew about the man in the white car. He was in his 20s and had 2 broken stumps where his front teeth should have been, and 5 metal studs in his ear. He didn't advertise his name. When people talked about him, they called him Skoda after the make of his car. But there was some who said that his name was Jake, and he had once been a Brookland. If so, he had come back like an unwelcome ghost. Here 1 minute, vanishing the next. Somehow, always a few seconds ahead of any passing police car or over inquisitive teacher. Skoda sold drugs. He sold soft drugs to the younger kids and harder stuff to any of the 6th formers stupid enough to buy it. It seemed incredible to ask that Skoda to get away with it so easily, dealing his little packets in broad daylight. In broad daylight. But of course, there was a code of honor in the school. No one turned anyone into the police, not even a rat like Skoda. And there was always the fear that if Skoda went down, some of the people he supplied, friends and classmates, might go with him. Drugs had never been a huge problem at Brooklyn, but recently that had begun to change. A clutch of 17-year-olds had started buying Skoda's goods, and like a stone dropped into a pool, the ripples had rapidly spread. There had been a spate of their thefts, as well as one of 2 bullying incidents. Younger children being forced to bring in money for older kids. The stuff Skoda was selling seemed to get more expensive the more he bought it, and it hadn't been cheap at the start. Alex watched as a heavy-shouldered boy with dark hair, Sirius Acton, lumbered over to the car, paused by a window, and then continued on his way. He felt a sudden jolt of anger. The boy's name was Colin, and just 12 months ago he had been one of Alex's best friends. In fact, Colin had been popular with everyone, but then everything had changed. He had become moody and withdrawn. His work had gone downhill. Suddenly nobody wanted to know him, and this was the reason Alex never thought much about drugs, apart from knowing that he would never take them himself. But he could see the man in the white car wasn't just poisoning a handful of dumb kids. He was poisoning the whole school. A policeman on foot patrol appeared, walking towards the gate. A moment later, the white car was gone, black smut bubbling from a faulty exhaust. Alex was on his bike before he knew what he was doing, pedaling fast out of the playground, swearing around the school secretary, who was also on her way home. "Not too fast, Alex!" she called out, and sighed when he ignored her. Miss Bedfordshire had always had a soft spot for Alex without knowing quite why, and she alone in the school had wondered if there hadn't been more to his absence than the doctor's note had suggested. The white Skoda accelerated down the road, turning left, then right, and Alex thought he was going to lose it, but then it twisted through the maze of back streets that led up to the King's Road and hit the inevitable 4 o'clock traffic jam. capital will hold about 200 metres ahead. The average speed of traffic in London, even in the 21st century, is lower than it used to be in Victorian times. During normal working hours, any bicycle will beat a car on just about any journey at all. And Alex wasn't riding just any bike. He still had his Condor Junior Road Racer, hand-built for him in the workshop that had been open for business in the same street in Holborn for more than 50 years. He'd recently had it upgraded to an integrated brake and gear level system fitted to the handlebar, and he only had to flick his thumb to feel the bike click up the gear, the lightweight titanium sprockets spinning smoothly beneath him. He caught up with the car just as it turned the corner and joined the rest of the traffic on the King's Road. He was just after home that Skoda was going to stay in the city, but somehow didn't think it likely that he would travel too far. The drug dealer hadn't chosen Brookland School as a target simply because he'd been there. It had to be somewhere in his general neighbourhood, not too close to home, but not too far either. The lights changed and the white car jerked forward, heading west. Alex was pedalling slowly, keeping a few cars behind, just in case Skoda happened to glance in his mirror. They reached the corner known as World's End, and suddenly the road was clear, and Alex had to switch gears again and pedal hard to keep up. The car drove on through Parsons Green and down towards Putney. Alex twisted from one lane to another, cutting in front of a taxi and receiving the blast of a horn as his reward. It was a very nice, soft, warm day. And he could feel his French and history homework dragging down his back. How much further were they going? And what would he do when they got there? Alice was beginning to wonder if this had been a good idea when the car turned off, and he realized they had arrived. Skoda had pulled into a rough tarmac area, a temporary car park next to the River Thames, not far from Putney Bridge. Alex stayed on the bridge, allowing the traffic to roll past, and watched as the drug dealer got out of his car and began to walk. The area was being redeveloped. Another block of prestige flats rising up to bruise the London skyline. Right now the buildings was no more than an ugly skeleton of steel girders and prefabricated concrete slabs. It was surrounded by a swarm of men in hard hats. They were bulldozers, cement mixers, and there were bulldozers. There were bulldozers, cement mixers, and towering above them all, a huge canary yellow crane. A sign read, Riverview House. All visitors reported to the site office. Alice wondered if Skoda had some sort of business on the site. He seemed to be heading for the entrance, but then he turned off. Alex watched him, puzzled. The building site was wedged in between the bridge and a cluster of modern buildings. There was a pub. There was a pub. Sorry, what it was. Oh yeah, there was a pub. Then what looked like a brand new conference centre, and finally a police station with a car park, half filled with official cars. But right next to the building site, sticking out into the river, was a wooden jetty with 2 cabin cruisers and an old iron barge and an old iron barge quietly rusting in the murky water. Alex and the working water. Alex hadn't noticed the jetty at first, but Skoda walked straight onto it, then climbed onto the barge. He opened the door and disappeared inside. Was this where he lived? It was late in the day somehow. Somehow Alex doubted he was about to set off on a pleasure cruise down the River Thames. He got back on his bike and cycled slowly to the end of the bridge, and then down towards the car park. He unclipped his helmet and left it with the backpack and the bike, which he pushed out of sight, then continued on foot, moving more slowly as he approached the jetty. He wasn't afraid of being caught. This was a public place, and even if Skoda did reappear, there would be nothing he could do. But he was curious. Just what was the drug dealer doing on board a barge? It seemed a bizarre place to have stopped. Alex still wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he wanted to have a look inside. Then he would decide. The wooden jetty creaked under his feet as he stepped onto it. The barge was called Blue Shadow. There was little blue left in the flaking paint, the rusty ironwork, and the dirty oil-covered decks. The barge was about 10 meters long and very square, with a single cabin in the center. It was lying low in the water, and Alex guessed that most of the living quarters would be underneath. He knelt down on the jetty and pretended to tie his shoelaces, hoping to look through the narrow slanting windows, but all the curtains were drawn. What now? The barge was moored on one side of the jetty. The two cruisers were side by side on the other. Skoda wanted privacy, but he must also need light, and there would be no need to draw the curtains on the far side with nothing there apart from the river. The only trouble was to look in the other windows. Alex would have to climb onto the barge itself. He considered briefly it had to be the worth the risk. He was near enough to the building site. Nobody was going to try to hurt him with so many people around. He placed one foot on the deck, then slowly transferred his weight onto it. He was afraid that moving the barge would give him away. Sure enough, the barge dipped under his weight. But Alex had chosen his moment well. The police launch was sailing past, heading up the river and back into town. The barge bobbed naturally in its wake. By the time it settled, Alex was on board, crouching next to the cabin door. Now he could hear music coming from inside, the heavy beat of a rock band. He didn't want to do it, but he knew there was only one way to look in. He tried to find an area of the deck that wasn't too covered in oil, then lay flat on his stomach, clinging onto the handrail. He lowered his head and shoulders over the side of the barge and shifted himself forward so that he was hanging almost upside down over the water. He was right. The curtains on this side of the window, he could see two men. Skoda was sitting on a bunk, smoking a cigarette. There was a second man, blonde hair and ugly, with twisted lips and 3 days stubble, wearing a torn sweatshirt and jeans, making a cup of coffee at a small stove. The music was coming from an old-fashioned radio, perhaps on a shelf. Alex looked around the cabin. Apart from 2 bunks and the miniature kitchen, the barge offered no living accommodation at all. Instead, it had to be converted for other purpose. Skoda and his friend had turned into a floating laboratory. There were 2 metal work surfaces, a sink, and a pair of electric scales everywhere. There were test tubes and burners, flasks, glasses, glass pipes, and measuring spoons. The whole place was filthy. Obviously, neither of the men cared about hygiene, but Alex knew that he was looking into the heart of their operation. This was where they prepared the drugs they sold, cut them down, weighed them, and packaged them for delivery to local schools. It was an incredible idea to put a drugs factory on a boat, almost in the middle of London, and only a stone's throw away from a police station. But at the same time, it was a clever one. Who would have looked for it here? The blonde man suddenly turned around and Alex hooked his body up and slid his backwards onto the deck. For a moment he was dizzy, hanging upside down. The blood had drained into his head. He took a couple of breaths, trying to collect his thoughts. It'd be easy enough to walk over to the police station and tell the officer in charge what he had seen. The police could take over from there, but something inside Alex rejected the idea. Maybe that was what he would have done a few months before. Let someone else take care of it. But he had cycled all this way just to call in the police. Yet he had thought back to his first sight. He remembered Colin, his friend, shuffling over to it, and felt once again a brief blaze of anger. This was something he wanted to do himself. What could he do? If the barge had been equipped with a plug, Alex would have pulled it out and sunk the entire thing. But, of course, it wasn't as easy as that. The barge was tied to the jetty by 2 thick ropes. He could untie them, but that wouldn't help either. The barge would drift away. When it was Putney, there were no whirlpools or waterfalls. Scotty would simply turn the engine on and cruise back again. Alex looked around him on the building site. The day's work was coming to an end. Some of the men were already leaving, and as he watched, he saw a trapdoor open and 100 meters above him, and a stocky man begin the long climb down from the top of the crane. Alex closed his eyes. A whole series of images had suddenly flashed into his mind, like different sections of jigsaw. The barge, the building site, the police station, the crane with its great hook dangling underneath the jib, and Blackpool Funfair. He had gone there once with his housekeeper, Jack Starbright, and had watched as she'd won a teddy bear, hooking it out of a glass case with mechanical claw and carrying it over to a chute. Could it be done? Alex looked again, working out of the angle. Yes, it probably could. He stood up and crept back across the deck to the door that Skoda had entered. There was a length of wire lying to one side, and he picked it up, then wound it several times round the handle of the door. He looped the wire over a hook in the wall and pulled it tight. The door was effectively locked. There was a second door at the back of the boat. Alex secured that one with his own bicycle padlock. As far as he could see, the windows were too narrow to crawl through in. There was no other way in or out. He crept off the barge and back onto the jetty. Then he untied it, leaving the thick rope loosely curled up beside the metal pegs. The stanchions that had secured it, the river was still. It would be a while before the barge drifted away. He straightened up, satisfied with his work. So far, he began to run. Chapter 3. Hooked. The entrance hooked, as in I'm hooked to a light bulb. The entrance to the building site was crowded with construction workers preparing to go home. Alex was reminded of Brookland an hour earlier. Nothing really changed when he got older, except that maybe you weren't given homework. The men and women were drifting out of their sight, were tired, in a hurry to be away. That was probably why none of them tried to stop Alex as he slipped in among them. walking purposefully, as if he knew where he was going, as if he had every right to be there. But the shift wasn't completely finished yet. Other workers were still carrying tools, stowing away machinery, packing up for the night. They were all wearing protective headgear and seeing a pile of plastic helmets. Alex snatched one up and put it on. The great sweep of the block of the flats that was being built loomed up ahead of him. To pass through it, he was forced into a narrow corridor between two scaffolding towers. Suddenly, a thick-set man in white overalls stepped in front of him, blocking his way. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "My dad." Alex gestured vaguely in the direction of another worker and kept walking. The trick worked. The man didn't challenge him again. He was heading for the crane. It was standing in the open. The high priest of construction Alex hadn't realized how tall it was until he reached it. The supporting tower was bolted into a massive block of concrete. The tower was very narrow. Once he had squeezed through the iron girders, he could reach out and touch all four sides. A ladder ran straight up the center without stopping to think. If he thought about it, he might change his mind. Alex began to climb. "It's only a ladder," he told himself. "You've climbed ladders before. You had nothing to worry about." But this ladder was 300 rungs. If Alex let go or slipped, there would be nothing to stop him falling to his death. There were rest platforms at intervals, but Alex didn't dare to stop to catch his breath. Somebody might look up and see him, and there was always a chance that the barge, loose from its moorings, might begin to drift. After 250 rungs, the tower narrowed. Alex could see the crane's control cabin directly above him. He looked back down. The man on the building site was suddenly very small and far away. He climbed the last stretch of the ladder. There was a trapdoor over his head leading into the cabin, but the trapdoor was locked. Fortunately, Alex was ready for this. When MI6 had sent him on his first mission, they had given him a number of gadgets. He couldn't exactly call them weapons to help him out of tight corners. One of these was a tube marked "Zip Clean for healthy skin," but the cream inside the tube did much more than clean up spots. Although Alex had used most of it, he had managed to hold the last remnants and often carried the tube with him as a sort of souvenir. He had it in his pocket now, holding on to the ladder with one hand. He took the tube out with the other. There was a very little of the cream left. But Alex knew that little was all he would need. But he opened the tube, squeezed some of the cream onto the lock, and waited. There was a moment pause, then a hiss and a wisp of smoke. The cream was eating into the metal. The lock sprang open. Alex pushed back the trapdoor and climbed through the last few rungs. He was in. He had to close the trapdoor again to create enough floor space to stand on. He found himself in a square metal box about the same size as a sit in an arcade game. There was a pilot's chair with two joysticks, one on each arm, and instead of a screen, a floor-to-ceiling window with a spectacular view of the building site, the river, and the whole of West London. A small computer monitor had been built into one corner, and at knee level there was a radio transmitter. The joysticks on the arms were surprisingly uncomplicated. Each had 6 buttons. There were even helpful diagrams to show what they did. The right hand would lift the hook up and down. The left hand would move it along the jib, closer to or further from the cabin. The left hand also controlled the whole top of the crane, rotating it 360 degrees. It couldn't have been much simpler. Even the start button was clearly labelled, a big button for a big toy. Alex couldn't help smiling as he reached out for the controls. This was going to be like Christmas come early. He pushed the button and felt the power surge into the control cabin. The computer lit up with a graphic of a barking dog, with a graphic of a barking dog as the warm-up program came into life. Alex eased himself into the operator's chair. There were still 20 or 30 men on the site looking down between his knees. He could see them moving silently far below. Nobody had noticed that anything was wrong, but he knew he still had to move fast. He pressed the green button on the right hand, control green for go, then touched his fingers against the joystick and pushed. Nothing happened, Alex found. Maybe it was going to be more complicated than he thought. What had he missed? He rested his hand on the joysticks, looking left and right for another control. His right hand moved slightly and suddenly the hook soared up from the ground. It was working. Unknown to Alex, when he gripped the handles of the joysticks, heat sensors were concealed inside and read his body temperatures and activated the crane. All modern cranes have the same security system built into them. In case the operator has a heart attack and falls against the controls, there can be no accidents. Body heat is needed to make the crane work. Luckily for him, this crane was a Liebherr 154 EC2H, one of the most modern in the world. The Liebherr is incredibly easy to use and remarkably accurate. Now, Alex pushed sideways with his left hand and gasped as the crane swung around in front of him. He could see the jib stretching out, swinging high over the rooftops of London. The more he pushed, the faster the crane went. The movement couldn't have been smoother. The Liebherr 154 has a fluid coupling between the electric motor and the gears so that it never jolts or shudders. It glides. Alex found a white button under his thumb and pressed it. The movement stopped at once. He was ready. He would need some beginner's luck, but he was sure he could do it, provided nobody looked up and saw the crane moving. He pushed with the left hand, and this time waited as the tip of the crane swung all the way past Putney Bridge and over the River Thames, where the tip was pointing directly over the barge. He stopped. Now he manoeuvred the cradle with the hook. First he slid it right to the end of the jib. Then, using his other hand, he lowered it quickly to begin with more slowly as it drew closer to ground level. The hook was solid metal. If he hit the barge, Scotia might hear it, and Alex would have given himself away. Carefully now, 1 centimetre at a time, Alex licked his lips and, using all the concentration, took careful aim. The hook crashed into the deck. Alex cursed. Surely Scotia would have heard it, and would even now be grappling with the door. Then he remembered the radio. Hopefully the music would have drowned out the noise. He lifted the hook at the same time, dragging it across the deck towards him. He had seen his target. There was a thick metal stanchion welded into the deck at the near end. If he could just loop around the stanchion, then he would have caught his fish. Then he could reel it in. His first attempt missed the stanchion by more than a metre. Alex forced himself not to panic. He had to do this slowly, or he would just have to hope that radio was still playing, and the sliding metal wasn't making too much noise. He missed the station a second time. This wasn't going to work. No, he could do it. It was the same as the fun fair, just bigger. He gritted his teeth and manoeuvred the hook a third time. This time, he saw it happen. The hook caught hold of the stanchion. He had it. He looked down. Nobody had noticed anything wrong. Now, how do you lift? He pulled with his right arm. The cable became taut. He actually felt the crane take the weight of the barge The whole tower tilted forward alarmingly, and Alex almost slid out of his seat. For the first time, he wondered if his plan was actually possible. Could the crane lift the barge out of the water? What was the maximum load? There was a white plate at the end of the crane now, printed with measurement 3,900 kg. Surely the boat couldn't weigh that much. He glanced at the computer screen. One set of digits was changing so rapidly. The weight that the crane was taking. What would happen if the boat was too heavy? Would the computer indicate it and automatically cut out, or would the whole thing just fall over? Alex settled himself in the chair and pulled back, wondering what would happen. Inside the boat, Skoda was opening a bottle of gin. He had a good day, selling more than £100 worth of merchandise to the kids at his old school. And the best thing was, they'd all be back for more. Soon he'd only sell them the stuff if they promised to introduce it to their friends. Then the friends would become customers too. It was the easiest market in the world. He'd got them hooked. They were his to do with as he liked. The blonde-haired man he was working with was called Mike Beckett. The two of them had met in prison, and the two of them had met in jail or prison, as it says here, and had decided to go into business together. When they got out, the boat had been Beckett's idea. There was no proper kitchen, no toilet, and it was freezing in winter. But it worked. It even amused them. So we so close to a police station. They enjoyed watching the police cars or boats going past. Of course, the pigs would never think of looking right on their own doorstep. Suddenly Beckett swore. What is it? Skoda looked up. The cup. Skoda watched as the cup of coffee which had been sitting on the shelf began to move. It slid sideways, then fell off with a clatter, spilling cold coffee on the grey rag. They called the carpet. Skoda was confused. The cup seemed to have to move on its own. Nothing had touched it. He giggled. How did you do that? He asked. I didn't. Then Becca was the first to realize what was happening. But even he couldn't guess the truth. We're sinking! He shouted. He scrabbled for the door. Now Skoda felt it for himself. The floor was tilting. Test tubes and beakers slid into each other, then crashed to the floor glass, shattering. He swore and followed Beckett uphill now. And every second that passed, the rake was becoming steeper. But the strange thing was that the barge didn't seem to be sinking at all. On the contrary, the front of it seemed to be rising out of the water. What's going on? He yelled. The door's jammed. Beckett had managed to open it in a crack, but the padlock on the other side was holding it firm. There's the other door. The second door was now high above them. Bottles rolling off the table and smashed in the kitchen. Soiled plates and mugs slid into each other, pieces flying with something between a sob and a snarl. Skoda trying to climb up the mountainside. The inside of the boat had become, but it was already too steep. The door was almost over his head. He lost his balance and fell backwards, shouting as, 1 second later, the other man was thrown on top of him. The two of them rolled into the corner, tangled up in each other. Plates, cups, knives, forks, and dozens of pieces of scientific equipment crashed into them. The walls of the barge were grinding with the pressure. A window shattered, a table turned itself into a battering ram and hurled itself at them. Skoda felt a bone snap in his arm and screamed out loud. The barge was completely vertical, hanging above the water at 90 degrees. For a moment it rested where it was, then it began to rise. Alex stared at the barge in amazement. The crane was lifting it at half speed. Some sort of override had come into action. Slowly operating down, but it wasn't even straining. Alex could feel the power under his palms. Sitting in the cabin with both hands on the joysticks, his feet apart and the jib of the crane jutting out ahead of him, he felt as if he and the crane had become one. He only had to move a centimetre and the boat would be brought to him. He could see it dangling on the hook, spinning slowly. Water was streaming off the stern. It was already clear of the water, rising up about a meter every 5 seconds. He wondered what it must be like inside. The radio beside his knee hissed into life. "Crane operator, this is base. What the hell do you think you're doing?" Over. Pause, a burst of sarcasm. Then the metal voice was back. "Who is in the crate? Who's up there? Identify yourself." There was a massive microphone snaking towards Alex's chin, and he was tempted to say something, but he decided against it. Hearing a teenage voice would only panic them more. He looked down. There were about a dozen constructors working, closing in on the base on the base of the crane. Others were pointing at the boat, jabbering amongst themselves. No sounds reached the cabin. It was as if Alex was cut off from the real world. It felt very secure. It had no doubt that more workers would have already started climbing the ladder, and that it would all be over soon. But for the moment he was untouchable. He concentrated on what he was doing. Getting the barge out of the water had been only half his plan. He still had to finish it. "Crane operator, lower the hook. We believe there are people inside the boat, and you are endangering their lives. Repeat, lower the hook." The barge was high above the water, dangling off the end of the hook. Alex moved his left hand, turning the crane round so that the boat was swung in an arc along the river and then over dry land. There was a sudden buzz. The jib came to a halt. Alex pushed the joystick. Nothing had happened. He glanced at the computer. The screen had gone blank. Someone at ground level had come to their senses and done the only sensible thing. They had switched off the power. The crane was dead. And Alex, where he was, watching the barge swaying in the breeze, he hadn't quite succeeded in what he had set out to do. He had planned to lower the boat along with its contents safely into the car park of the police station. It would have made a nice surprise for the authorities, he had thought. Instead, the boat was now hanging over the conference centre that he had seen from Putney Bridge. By the end of the day, he didn't suppose it made much difference. The end result would be the same. He stretched his arms and relaxed, waiting for the trapdoor to burst open. This wasn't going to be easy to explain. And then he heard the tearing sound. The missile stanchion that produced from the end of the deck had not been designed to carry the entire weight of the barrage. It was a miracle that it had lasted as long as it had. As Alex watched, open mouthed from the cabin, the stanchion tore itself free. For a few seconds it clung by one edge to the deck. Then the last metal rivet came loose. The barge had 60 meters above the ground. Now it began to fall. In the Putney Riverside Conference Centre, the chief constable of the Metropolitan Police was addressing a large crowd of journalists, TV cameras, civil servants, and government officials. He was a tall, thin man who took himself very seriously. His dark blue uniform was immaculate. Every piece of silver, the studs on his epaulettes to his 5 medals, was polished until it gleamed. This was his big day. He was sharing platform with no less a personage than the Home Secretary himself. The assistant chief constable was there, and also 7 lower ranking officers. A slogan was being projected onto the wall behind him: "Winning the war against drugs." Silver letters on a blue background. The chief constable had chosen the colours himself, knowing that they matched his uniform. He liked the slogan. He knew that it would be in all the major newspapers the next day. And, just as important as a photograph of himself, "We have overlooked nothing," he would say, his voice echoing around the muddy room. He could see the journalists scribbling down his every word. The television cameras were all focused on him. "Thanks to my personal involvement and efforts, we have never been more successful, Home Secretary." He smiled at the senior politician. He smiled toothily back. "But we are not resting on our laurels. Oh no, any day now we are hoping to announce another breakthrough. That was when the barge hit the glass roof on the conference centre. There was an explosion. The chief constable just had time to dive for cover as a vast dripping object plunged down towards him. The Home Secretary was thrown back with his spectacles flying off his face. His security men froze helpless. The boat crashed into the space in front of them, between the stage and the audience. The side of the cabin had been torn off, and what was left of the laboratory was exposed, with the two dealers sprawled together in one corner, staring dazedly at the hundreds of policemen and officials who were now surrounded them. A cloud of white powder mushroomed up and then fell onto the dark blue uniform of their chief constable, covering him from head to toe. The fire alarms had gone off. The lights fused and went out. Then the screaming began. Meanwhile, the first of the construction workers had made it to the crane cabin and was gazing in astonishment at the 14-year-old boy he had found there. "Do you," he stammered, "do you have any idea what you've just done?" And he glanced at the empty hut and at the gaping hole in the roof of the conference centre. At the rising smoke and dust, he shrugged apologetically. I was just working on the crime figures, he said, and I think there's been a drop. Right, everybody, that'll be the end of the video. My first time reading you the series of Alex Rider on the second book. I am actually shocked to read this in to start reading this book in 2 days. Because I finished the last book in 2 days. So bye everyone, and thank you for listening to me reading you the first book of Alex Rider. So bye everyone, and thank you for listening to this book. How do I turn it off?